way above the fertile soil of economic growth. It had at all costs to be melted, so that that soil could be ploughed by the forces of profit-pursuing private enterprise. This implied three kinds of changes. In the first place, land had to be turned into a commodity, possessed by private owners and freely purchasable and saleable by them. In the second place, it had to pass into the ownership of a class of men willing to develop its productive resources for the market and impelled by reason, i.e., enlightened self-interest and profit. In the third place, the great mass of the rural population had in some way to be transformed, at least in part, into freely mobile wage workers for the growing non-agricultural sector of the economy. Two major obstacles stood in the way of such an imposition, and both required a combination of political and economic action: pre-capitalist landlords and traditional peasantry. On the other hand, the task could be fulfilled in a variety of ways. The most radical were the British and the American, for both eliminated the peasantry and won the landlord together. The classical British solution produced a country in which perhaps 4,000 proprietors owned perhaps 4/7 of the land which was cultivated. I take the 1851 figures, by 250,000 farmers, 3/4 of the acreage being in farms from 50 to 500 acres, who employed about 1.25 million of hired labourers and servants. Pockets of smallholders persisted, but outside of the Scots Highlands and parts of Wales, only a pedant can speak of a British peasantry in the continental sense. The classical American solution was that of the owner occupying commercial farm, who made up for the shortage of a hired labour force by intensive mechanization. Obed Hussey's 1833 and Cyrus McCormick's 1834 mechanical reapers were the complement to the purely commercial-minded farmers or land-speculating entrepreneurs who extended the American way of life westwards from the New England states, seizing their land or later by buying it at the most nominal prices from the government. The Northern American solution depended on the unique fact of a virtually unlimited supply of free land and the absence of all relics of feudal relations or traditional peasant collectivism. Virtually the only obstacle to the extension of pure individualistic farming was the slight one of the Red Indian tribes, whose lands, normally guaranteed by treaties with the British, French and American governments, were held in collectivity, often as hunting grounds. Nomadic and primitive Indians were not the only people who neither understood the bourgeois individualist rationalism on the land nor wished for it. In fact, with the exception of minorities of the enlightened, the acquisitive, and the strong and sober among the peasantry, the vast bulk of the rural population from the largest feudal lord down to the most poverty-stricken shepherd united in abominating it. Only a politico-legal revolution directed against both lords and traditional peasants could create the conditions in which the rational minority might become the rational majority. The history of agrarian relations over most of Western Europe and its colonies in our period is the history of this revolution, though its full consequences were not felt until the second half of the century. Above all, in Catholic and Muslim countries, Protestant ones had long since done so, the great block of ecclesiastical land had to be taken out of the Gothic realm of non-economic superstition and opened to the market and rational exploitation. Secularization and sale awaited them. The equally vast blocks of collectively owned and therefore badly utilized lands of village and town communities, common fields, common pastures, woodlands, etc., had to be made accessible to individual enterprise. Division into individual lots and enclosure awaited them. That the new purchasers would be the enterprising, strong and sober could hardly be doubted, and thus the second of the objects of the agrarian revolution would be achieved, but only on condition that the peasantry, from whose ranks many of them would doubtless arise, was itself turned into a class freely capable of disposing of its resources, a step which would also automatically achieve the third object, the creation of a large, free labour force composed from those who failed to become bourgeois. The liberation of the peasant from non-economic bonds and duties, villanage, serfdom, payments to lords, forced labour, slavery, etc., was therefore also essential. This would have an additional and crucial advantage, for the free wage labourer open to the incentive of higher rewards, or the free farmer could be shown, it was thought, to be a more efficient worker than the forced labourer, whether serf, peon or slave. Only one further condition had to be fulfilled: the very large number of those who now vegetated on the land to which all human history tied them, but who, if it were productively exploited, would be a mere surplus population, had to be torn away from their roots and allowed to move freely. Only thus would they migrate into the towns and factories, where their muscles were increasingly needed. In other words, the peasants had to lose their land together with their other bonds. Some 5,000 enclosures under the Private and General Enclosure Acts brought up 6 million acres of common fields and common lands from 1750 onwards, transformed them into private holdings, and numerous less formal arrangements supplemented them. The Poor Law of 1834 was designed to make life so intolerable for the rural paupers as to force them to migrate to any jobs that offered. And indeed they soon began to do so. In the 1840s, several counties were already on the verge of an absolute loss of population, and from 1850, land flight became general. The arguments of the enclosure propagandists were commonly phrased in terms of higher rental values and higher yield per acre. In village after village, enclosure destroyed the scratch-as-scratch-can subsistence economy of the poor. The cottager, without legal proof of rights, was rarely compensated. The cottager, who was able to establish his claim, was left with a parcel of land inadequate for subsistence and a disproportionate share of the very high enclosure cost. Enclosure, when all the sophistications are allowed for, was a plain enough case of class robbery, played according to fair rules of property and law laid down by a parliament of property owners and lawyers. Recent scholarship suggests that the rules of the game were kept to more fairly than was suggested by the Hammonds in their great Village Labourer. Even very small property owners received reasonable treatment, many enclosure commissioners acted conscientiously, and so on. But in making these useful qualifications, it is possible to overlook the larger fact that what was at issue was a redefinition of the nature of agrarian property itself. Thus, Chambers and Mingay have noted that, in enclosure, the occupiers of right cottages, who enjoyed common right by virtue of their tenancy of the cottage, received no compensation because they were not, of course, the owners of the rights. This was a perfectly proper distinction between owner and tenant, and involved no fraud or disregard for cottagers on the part of the commissioners. But what was perfectly proper in terms of capitalist property relations involved nonetheless a rupture of the traditional integument of village custom and of right, and the social violence of enclosure consisted precisely in the drastic total imposition upon the village of capitalist property definitions. Of course, such definitions had been encroaching within the village for centuries before enclosure, but they had coexisted with these self-governing and customary elements in the structure of the pre-capitalist village community, which, while they were no doubt crumbling under the pressure of increasing population, persisted with remarkable vigour in many places. Copyhold and even vaguer customary family tenancies, which carried common rights, might prove to be invalid at law, although they were endorsed by the collective memory of the community. Those petty rights of the villagers, such as gleaning, access to fuel, and the tethering of stock in the lanes or on the stubble, which are irrelevant to the historian of economic growth, might be of critical importance to the subsistence of the poor. Enclosure indeed was the culmination of a long secular process by which men's customary relations to the agrarian means of production were undermined. It was of profound social consequence because it illuminates, both backwards and forwards, the destruction of the traditional elements in English peasant society. If one looks at English agriculture in the 18th century through the pages of Arthur Young's Annals of Agriculture, or the various county surveys prepared at the turn of the century for the Board of Agriculture, it is possible to suppose that customary sanctions had long lost their force. But if one looks at the scene again from the standpoint of the villager, one finds a dense cluster of claims and usages which stress from the common to the marketplace, and which, taken together, make up the economic and cultural universe of the rural poor. Professor Chambers has well written, "The appropriation to their own exclusive use of practically the whole of the common waste by legal owners meant that the curtain which separated the growing army of labourers from utter proletarianization was torn down. It was, no doubt, a thin and squalid curtain, but it was real, and to deprive them of it without providing a substitute implied the exclusion of the labourers from the benefits which their intensified labour alone made possible. The loss of the commons entailed for the poor a radical sense of displacement. One encounters an exceptional note of vehemence in some of the protests against enclosure which crop up from time to time in the Home Office papers, as witness an anonymous letter of 1799 addressed to Oliver Cromwell, Esquire of Cheshunt Park. "We write these lines to you, who are the combine of the parish of Cheshunt, in the defence of our parish rights which you unlawfully are about to disinherit us of. Resolutions is made by the aforesaid combine that if you intend of enclosing our common fields, Lammas, Meads, Marshes, and co., we resolve before, that bloody and awful act, it is finished to have your heart's blood if you proceed in the aforesaid bloody act. We, like horse leeches, will cry, give, give, until we have spilt the blood of everyone that wishes to rob the innocent unborn. It shall not be in your power to say I am safe from the hands of my enemy, for we, like birds of prey, will privily lie in wait to spill the blood of the aforesaid characters, whose names and places of abode are as putrefied sores in our nostrils. We declare that thou shalt not say I am safe when thou goest to thy bed, for beware that thou liftest not thine eyes up in the most mist of flames. There is evidence at the end of the 18th century of increasing pressure on the commons and of an overstocking, not only by squatters and cottagers, but also by large graziers. In such a context, the dividing lines between the interests of the very small proprietor and the poor cottager became of critical importance. The small proprietor was interested in the strictest stinting and regulation of common rights. It was in the interest of the cottager or squatter that a more lax definition of customs should prevail. The eyes of the small proprietor, like those of any peasant in any age and country, might glitter at the short-term prospect of outright proprietorship, even the 4 or 5 acres which enclosure might bring, but the cottager without any proprietary rights by enclosure lost all. In the long run, the gains of the small proprietors might prove to be illusory, but the illusion was sustained during the high price years of the French wars. Indeed, both of the major objects of the operation, more food and higher rents, were obtained throughout the wars. Rents rose very markedly in areas of recent enclosure, and they were sustained both by higher prices and higher yields per acre. When prices fell in 1815 to 1816 and in 1821, rents remained high, or came down as they usually do, tardily, thereby spelling the ruin of many smallholders who had clung on to their few acre holdings gained from enclosure. High rents sustained extraordinary luxury and ostentatious expenditure among the landowners, while high prices nourished higher social pretensions among the farmers and their wives. But greed alone cannot account for the position into which the labourer was driven in these years. How was it possible, when the wealth of the landowners and farmers were rising, for the labourer to be held at brute subsistence level? We must look for an answer in the general counter-revolutionary tone of the whole period. It is possible that the real wages of labourers had been rising in the decades before 1790, especially in areas contagious to manufacturing or mining districts. There wants a war to reduce wages was the cry of some northern gentry in the 1790s, and the reflexes of panic and class antagonism inflamed in the aristocracy by the French Revolution were such as to remove inhibitions and to aggregate the exploitative relationship between masters and servants. To the argument of greed, a new argument was added for general enclosure, that of social discipline. The commons, the poor man's heritage for ages past, on which Tom and Bewick could recall independent labourers still dwelling, who had built their cottages with their own hands, were now seen as a dangerous centre of indiscipline. Arthur Young saw them as a breeding ground for barbarians, nursing up a mischievous race of people of the Lincolnshire fens. So wild a country nurses up a race of peoples as wild as the fen. Ideology was added to self-interest. It became a matter of public-spirited policy for the gentleman to remove cottages from the commons, reduce his labourers to dependence, pare away at supplementary earnings, drive out the smallholder. At a time when Wordsworth was extolling the virtues of old Michael and his wife in their struggle to maintain their patrimonial fields, the very much more influential Commercial and Agricultural magazine regarded the yeoman in a different light. A wicked, cross-grained, petty farmer is like the sow in his yard, almost an insulated individual who has no communication with, and therefore no reverence for, the opinion of the world. As for the rights of the cottager in enclosure, it may seem needless to notice his claims, but the interest of the other claimants is ultimately concerned in permitting the labouring man to acquire a certain portion of land, for by this indulgence the poor rate must be speedily diminished, since 1/4 of an acre of garden ground will go a great way towards rendering the peasant independent of any